A wrongful arrest, a calm man, and a secret call that triggered alarms in the state's highest office. Who is Malik Dorsey and why did his silence shake the whole system? Hit like if you're tired of justice being mistaken for order. Subscribe for more untold truths. Now let's dive into the moment it all began. It was a quiet morning. The kind of morning where the city hadn't fully woken up yet, where the breeze still held on to the last coolness of night, and the sidewalk outside Pascal's bakery smelled like butter and sugar. Malik Dorsey, 36, stood by the corner with a warm croissant in hand and his coat buttoned neatly up to his chest. He looked sharp, clean, calm, just a man on his way to start another day. But in America, sometimes that's all it takes to be seen as a threat. A police cruiser slowed down on the opposite side of the street, then turned sharply and pulled over. Two officers stepped out. Dean Walker first, tall, tight-jawed, and already reaching for his belt. Behind him, Officer Haley Burns moved with less tension, but with no less certainty. Neither said hello. Walker scanned him up and down, then spoke like reading from a script. Black male, navy coat. We got a match. Malik turned his head, slightly not startled, just aware. He didn't ask what he was being accused of, didn't ask who had called it in, because none of that ever seemed to matter in moments like this. Burns approached from the side, hand hovering over her cuffs. We need you to step back, sir. Hands where I can see them. Malik blinked once, then slowly, so slowly it almost seemed like a gesture of peace, he raised his hands. Still, Walker grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back with force. The croissant dropped to the pavement. Steam rose from the torn layers as they hit the ground, mixing with the dust in the gutter water. Burns patted him down roughly while looking away from his face. The way people do when they don't want to make eye contact with the part of the truth that looks back at them. A few pedestrians paused. One man took out his phone. A woman gasped but kept walking. Inside the bakery window, a young boy stood with his mother watching silently. The mother leaned down, touched his shoulder, and turned him gently away. Malik didn't resist. He didn't yell or plead. The only sound he made was the quiet drag of breath between his lips. And then as Walker pulled out his wallet without asking, Malik said just one thing. Calm, steady, measured like a man who had been here before. I'd like to make a phone call. Just one. There was a pause. Not because they were considering it, but because his voice didn't match what they expected. No panic, no fear. Walker smirked, already annoyed. This ain't a request line, buddy. But Burns hesitated. She looked him in the eye for the first time, and something in that gaze caught her off guard. It wasn't pleading, it wasn't anger, it was patience. That quiet kind of patience that unnerves people who don't understand where it comes from. They led him to the squad car, still cuffed. No questions asked, no explanations offered. Just the weight of assumption pressing down on every step. And as the car door slammed shut, Malik sat back, his eyes fixed on the sky. There was no struggle. Only a silence that felt deliberate. Because what Walker and Burns didn't know, what they never thought to ask, was that Malik's phone call wasn't for a lawyer. It wasn't for a friend. It was a signal, a key turning in a lock. And by the time they realized who he really was, it would already be too late. Inside the back seat of the squad car, Malik sat with his wrists still cuffed, the metal biting into his skin, but his expression calm. Outside the window, the city rolled by like any other morning. Delivery trucks parked crooked on the curb. Teenagers walked with headphones on. A man in a suit checked his watch impatiently at the light. To them, it was just another arrest, a routine stop. Maybe someone did something wrong. Maybe not. But who would know, really? Malik lowered his head, leaned slightly forward, and spoke softly, so softly that even the camera on the dash might have missed it if it weren't listening for the right code. Dorsey, code 14, begin oversight. That was all he said. Then silence returned. Miles away in a windowless office beneath the State Department of Civil Accountability, a woman named Jenny Huynh was sipping cold coffee when her monitor blinked red. One word flashed across the encrypted interface: priority oversight. Classified tag Dorsey. Jenny blinked. At first she thought it was a system error, Malik Dorsey. The name rang a faint bell, but not in a way she could place. She tapped the keyboard, pulled up the clearance chain, then froze when the secondary alert chimed: do not override, do not delay. Oversight request active. Subject embedded. Her fingers hovered above the keys, embedded. The system automatically logged a timestamp and pinged a higher tier in the oversight network. Jenny was trained for this. She had worked in internal investigations long enough to know what a code 14 meant. It wasn't a routine monitor request. It wasn't a mistake. It was one of those very rare classifications only assigned to agents conducting undercover integrity surveillance on law enforcement personnel, especially when the system suspected misuse of force, procedural discrimination, or rights violations. But here's what didn't make sense. If Dorsey was internal, why hadn't her team been briefed? Why was there no pre-log in the oversight queue? And why would an operative of that classification be walking around alone without dispatch support or backup? Jenny leaned back in her chair. The air in the room felt a little thinner. She reread the alert again. Active surveillance, ongoing, do not intervene. Which meant one thing. Malik wasn't supposed to be safe. He was supposed to be seen. And in being seen, he was supposed to reveal something no one else had been able or willing to expose. She opened a secure chat line, typed a quick line to her supervisor, then stopped herself. The system had already notified the director's office. Her role wasn't to interfere. It was to watch, document, and wait. And so she waited. But the weight of the screen stayed with her. Not just the red blinking warning, but the realization that something in the system had shifted without her knowing. That someone somewhere had authorized Malik's mission, but kept it off the books. And now here he was in cuffs playing out a script written in shadows. Jenny stared at the feed for a long moment, then whispered to herself, barely audible, "Why didn't anyone tell us?" She didn't yet know what Dorsey was after, but she knew this much. When a man like that activates a Code 14, it doesn't mean trouble's coming. It means it's already here. At first, nothing felt out of the ordinary. The precinct moved with its usual rhythm, reports being typed. Coffee being poured, small talk drifting between desks. Officers Dean Walker and Haley Burns had done this routine more times than they could count. Just another morning, just another suspect, just another line crossed. Walker sat at his desk, casually entering notes from the arrest, while Burns leaned against the wall, arms crossed, looking bored. Malik Dorsey had been booked and placed in holding. No resistance. No shouting, just that one calm request. "May I make one phone call?" Then the front desk phone rang. Not the dispatch line, not an internal extension. This was something else. The sergeant picked it up, nodded, said nothing. His face went still, as if something behind his eyes had gone cold. After a pause, he simply answered, "Yes, sir," and hung up without another word. He walked past Walker without making eye contact, heading straight to holding. Burns straightened slightly. "What was that about?" she asked, but the sergeant didn't answer. Malik was still sitting on the bench, still calm, still composed. If the cuffs on his wrists had left marks, he didn't show it. If he felt anger, he didn't let it surface. The sergeant opened the door, stepped inside, and unlocked the cuffs. "You're free to go, sir," he said quietly, respectfully, on direct order from the State Inspector General's office. Walker turned confused. "What do you mean, direct order? He hasn't even—" But the sergeant was already walking away. Malik stood up slowly. He adjusted the sleeves of his coat, picked up his folded croissant bag, still untouched, and began walking toward the front of the precinct with unhurried steps. Not a single word spoken, not a glance wasted. And then he paused. Walker's desk sat near the exit. On it, a yellow legal pad half filled with careless notes from the arrest. Malik reached over, picked up the pen beside it, and calmly wrote one line on a blank page. He didn't look back. He placed the pen exactly where it was before walked to the doors and pushed them open. The morning sun spilled into the room as he stepped outside. Walker, frowning, approached his desk and glanced at the note. He read the line once, then again, and this time he didn't move. It said, "Senior Counsel Division of Civil Accountability." The words didn't shout, they didn't accuse, but they echoed like a gavel striking deep inside the room. Burns joined him, looking over his shoulder. Neither said anything. Because in that moment, they both understood this wasn't over. It had only just begun. They arrived like they had 100 times before, uniforms pressed, expressions blank, and egos untouched. Officers Dean Walker and Haley Burns were used to review boards. They'd been through enough to know that most of them were a formality, a paper trail, a quiet slap on the wrist behind closed doors. But this time the hallway didn't feel routine. There was a buzz in the air they couldn't name. The receptionist avoided eye contact. A man in a gray suit held the door for them but didn't smile. They stepped into the room. It wasn't an office, it was a tribunal. The space opened into rows of seated observers, civil rights attorneys, state investigators, and members of the press. Cameras were mounted in corners. A court stenographer sat ready. Every chair faced forward, all eyes drawn to the head of the long table. And there he was, Malik Dorsey, not in handcuffs, not in the clothes of a man just passing through. He sat composed, dressed in black and gray, with a folder in front of him, in a quiet focus that pierced the air. His presence was calm, but the power in it hit like a stone through glass. Walker froze mid-step. Burns whispered under her breath, "What the hell is this?" Neither of them sat down. Malik didn't rise. He simply looked up. "Officers," he said, his voice level. "Take a seat. Let's begin." His fingers flipped open the folder. A large screen on the wall blinked to life. Malik nodded once. The footage began. It was March 5th. The sidewalk, the bakery, the morning sun casting long shadows. Malik walked out with a croissant in one hand and a cup in the other. Then came the officers, Walker and Burns. Fast, aggressive. No greeting, no questions, just hands force, and a voice in the background, Malik's low and measured. Slow. "May I make one phone call?" The room didn't move. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Malik paused the video at the exact moment he was on the ground, knee pressed to concrete, eyes staring down, not in fear, but in stillness. Then he looked at them. No warrant, no confirmation, just a man buying breakfast who matched the description. Burns leaned forward, her voice rising. "We had probable cause." Malik raised his hand slowly, not as a warning, but as a command no one questioned. "I'll give you the same courtesy you gave me," he said. "You'll speak when permitted." Walker shifted, jaw tight. The power dynamic had flipped so violently it felt like the air had changed color. Malik turned to the room. "Everyone in this building knows what that phrase means, matched a description. It's not evidence. It's not protocol. It's camouflage for a decision already made." He let that settle. Then he dropped the next blow. "What you didn't know," Malik said, his voice colder now, "is that the man you threw to the sidewalk is the chief legal officer of the state's Civil Accountability Division, the man who's been investigating your unit for nearly 9 months." There was no applause, no reaction, just stunned silence, the kind that burns more than 1,000 voices. He leaned back, eyes never leaving theirs. "Exhibit B will begin shortly. It includes statistical analysis, use of force records, and sealed complaints previously buried by internal channels. All of them involving your names." Burns went pale. Walker opened his mouth, then closed it again. Malik stood, not to intimidate, but to claim the space as his own. "You thought I was the story," he said, quietly, "but I'm the mirror." And then he sat back down. The room didn't move. The screen flickered to the next file, and Justice Long's silence began to speak with teeth. The room had fallen into a heavy silence after the opening footage ended. No one spoke. The clip showed Walker and Burns approaching Maliki outside the bakery, detaining him without a word of explanation. No shouting, no resistance, just two officers dragging a man for fitting a description neither could clearly define. Malik stood slowly and walked to a screen behind the panel. With a quiet confidence, he pulled up a spreadsheet. No drama, no theatrics, just rows and columns bathed in white and blue light. "This," he said, tapping the screen, "is not about one incident. It's about a pattern." He paused, letting the quiet stretch just enough. "These are detentions conducted by officers Walker and Burns over the past 18 months. Here," he pointed, "we see the time, the location, the reason cited, and the demographic." He turned toward the officers. 66 of them were black, 8 were Latino, 4 Asian, 3 white. Walker shifted uncomfortably. Burns said nothing. One of the council members raised an eyebrow. "And the justification for these stops?" Malik responded, still calm. "Loitering, suspicion, resembling a suspect, smelling like marijuana, wearing a hoodie, looking nervous, being in a high-crime area, walking alone at night, eating on the steps, carrying a backpack." He paused again. None of these resulted in charges. Then he called his first witness. An older man with a gentle gait walked in and took the seat. "State your name, please." "Thomas Avery," he said, "former school administrator." "Mr. Avery, were you stopped by Officer Walker last fall?" He nodded. "I was waiting outside the library. My granddaughter was inside getting her books." "And what reason did the officer give for the stop?" Mr. Avery looked down. He said, "I looked out of place. I asked him where exactly he thought a grandfather waiting for a child should be." Malik gave a small, solemn nod. "Were you charged?" "No, just embarrassed. My granddaughter saw it all." Malik thanked him, then brought in a second witness, a retired nurse, Ms. Yvonne Mason. She held a cane in her lap as she spoke. "They pulled me over because I was going 5 under the speed limit. Said it was suspicious. I had groceries in the back seat. I offered to let them look. They refused. Just told me to be careful and left." "And how did that make you feel?" Malik asked gently. "Like I was prey, like I didn't belong in my own neighborhood." Malik turned back to the room, voice quiet but steady. These aren't isolated stories. These are threads in the same fabric. If it happens once, it might be a misunderstanding. But when it happens over and over to the same groups of people by the same hands, it becomes a system. He walked back to the table, placed both hands on it, and leaned forward slightly. Officers, Walker and Burns, do you know how many people you have handcuffed simply because they were tired, or afraid, or black? Walker didn't answer. Malik didn't expect him to. The truth, he said, lifting the printout from the projector, isn't loud. It's a spreadsheet, and in this room it speaks for those who were silenced. There were no raised voices, no banging on tables, just facts and faces, and one man finally being heard. As Malik sat down, the air seemed heavier, not because of anger, but because the weight of evidence was too real to ignore. And just before the room could exhale, he looked toward the panel once more. There's one more statement to review, he said softly, but I'll need the body cam footage from March 5th to proceed. The officers froze, their eyes flicked toward each other, and in that small, shared glance, something cracked. But Malik didn't press. Not yet. He let the silence speak just as powerfully as the data had. The room was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was pressure, heavy and waiting. We're missing the body cam footage from March 5th, said a board member, her voice tight. According to the logs, the file existed. Now it doesn't. A ripple of confusion swept the panel. Malik didn't speak. He turned slightly, eyes narrowing at Walker and Burns, who now sat more upright, suddenly aware they weren't just guests in this room, they were subjects. Then came Walker's voice, clipped and defensive. We don't handle data logs, that's not our role. If something's missing, it's a tech issue, not us. Malik didn't blink. You sure about that? Burns leaned forward, trying to regain ground. Are you seriously accusing us of tampering with evidence? Because that's slander, and I hope you have more than guesswork to back it up. Malik held her gaze. Oh, we have more than guesswork. Just then the back doors opened. Jenny Hoon stepped in, holding a small USB drive in both hands like it weighed more than it should. Her voice was steady, though something about her jaw said she'd spent the night deciding whether to show up at all. I mirrored the footage to a personal backup, she said, placing the drive on the table. I'm aware that's not standard protocol, but neither is wiping internal evidence. The panel looked at her. So did Walker, his expression darkening. That's an unauthorized copy, he snapped. You're violating chain of custody. Jenny turned to him slowly. And yet, here it is. Unwiped. Untouched. Unlike the one you handled. Gasps scattered through the observers, soft and sharp. Malik finally stood, calm but rising. She didn't violate the chain, he said. She preserved it, while someone else was trying to bury it. Burns stood too now, knocking her chair back. You don't get to play God just because you have a desk and a tie. You ambushed us. You're not a judge. You're a civil rights attorney, Malik interrupted, voice low but electric, and a federal investigator under the Office of Public Accountability. You assumed I was a man eating a croissant. You never asked who I was. You only saw what you expected to see. Walker scoffed. This is a circus. Malik stepped forward closer now, but never raising his voice. No, a circus has rules, timing, order. What you've created out there is chaos. A system where your badge gives you power but not purpose, where losing a file is more convenient than facing what it shows. He turned to Jenny and gave her a nod. Play it. The screen flickered. The room dimmed. And there it was. Walker and Burns. The bakery, the shove, the handcuffs. Malik's voice from the footage calm as it had been in real life. I'd like to make one phone call. Back in the room, the silence shifted again. It wasn't pressure anymore. It was exposure. Something raw. Jenny stepped back. Her hands were trembling now, but her face was steady. A board member leaned forward. Miss Huynh, are you saying someone with high-level clearance removed this footage deliberately? Jenny nodded. There are only 3 people in the system with that access, and it wasn't me. Walker opened his mouth, but no sound came. Malik didn't give him time. When justice disappears, people think she's failed. But justice doesn't fail, he said. She watches, she waits, she remembers. And sometimes, she needs someone brave enough to speak when others go quiet. He turned to the panel. Today that someone is not me, it's her. Jenny looked stunned. Then slowly she lowered her head. Walker slumped back into his chair. Burns stared at the floor. Malik returned to his seat. His hands were still. And the screen kept playing. Because the truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be seen. Before there were hearings and body cams and courtroom silences that spoke louder than any gavel could, there was just a boy. A boy walking home from school with a backpack too big for his frame and no idea the world had already made up its mind about him. Malik Dorsey was 15 the first time he was cuffed. Not for stealing, not for fighting, not for breaking a single law, just walking, slowly, alone, on a block that someone somewhere decided he didn't belong. He had just stayed late after the class working on a history project with a friend. They were studying the Constitution, ironic looking back, and Malik left the school building a little before sunset, his hoodie pulled over his head against the spring chill. He had taken the same shortcut he always did down Juniper Street near the old church. That's where the patrol car crept up behind him. At first he thought maybe they were just passing by. But when the lights flicked on without the siren and the two officers stepped out like they'd been waiting for him, something in Malik's chest tightened. They asked where he was going. He said home. They asked for ID. He said it was in his backpack. They asked if he was trying to be smart. He said no. They asked why. He looked nervous. He said because he was. And then they told him to turn around. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He remembered his mother's voice from 1,000 nights before, don't fight, don't talk back, just come home to me. So he turned around. They handcuffed him in the middle of the sidewalk while cars rolled by, and someone across the street pulled back their curtain but didn't step outside. His backpack hit the ground. His textbooks spilled out. He stared down at the cracks in the pavement and counted his breaths like they might run out if he wasn't careful. At the station, they told him he fit the description, that someone had called in a report of a suspicious person near the alleyway. They didn't say sorry. They didn't offer a ride home. They just uncuffed him, handed him back his bag, and told him to be more careful next time. Malik walked home under the same sunset, but nothing about the world looked the same. That night, his mother sat beside him at the kitchen table. She didn't cry. She just placed one hand over his and whispered, don't speak, don't fight, just survive. That's the rule, baby. You survive and we'll figure the rest out later. He nodded, but he didn't sleep, because something inside him had shifted quietly permanently. And in the space where his innocence used to live, something new started to grow. It wasn't hate, it wasn't even anger, not really. It was a kind of fire. Slow, steady, controlled. It told him he would never let another child feel what he felt. That he would one day speak in rooms where those officers could only listen. That he would learn the law not to hide behind it, but to face it head on. He kept his head down through high school, got into college early, law school even earlier, but he never forgot. Not the sound of the cuffs, not the cold metal, not the silence of everyone who passed by and did nothing. That night on Juniper Street didn't just change him, it built him. So years later, when he sat in that hearing room with officers in front of him and justice hanging in the balance, Malik wasn't just doing a job. He was fulfilling a promise made by a boy with bruised wrists and no voice who chose not to scream, but to study. Not to fight back with fists, but with facts. And in that moment when he looked up and met their eyes, there was no triumph, just clarity. Because this wasn't revenge. It was restoration. And somewhere deep in his memory, he could still hear his mother's voice. But this time it sounded different. This time she wasn't whispering for him to survive. This time she was watching him lead. The room held its breath. After hours of testimony, witness accounts, and data laid bare, the Internal Oversight Committee finally reached a decision. The silence was deliberate, as if even the walls needed a moment to absorb the weight of what was coming. The chairwoman stood, her voice steady but somber. Effective immediately, Officers Dean Walker and Haley Burns are permanently suspended from duty. Their conduct has been deemed a breach of civil rights, and their case is being escalated to federal review. Gas rippled quietly through the rows behind them. Some shook their heads. Others, like the journalist from the Sentinel, scribbled faster than they could breathe. But Malik Dorsey didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He merely closed the folder in front of him and looked out the long window behind the tribunal desk. Outside, the world continued, cars passed. Someone laughed, a bird darted under the awning. But inside the room, history had shifted. And yet Malik's expression remained unreadable. If victory had a sound, it wasn't cheering. It was this, the hollow creak of an old system giving way, even if just slightly. He finally rose slow and composed his polished shoes, clicking softly against the courtroom floor. And just as he reached the exit, he turned not to the officers nor the press, but to the room itself, as though addressing every courtroom, past and future. We don't celebrate when the system corrects itself, he said quietly. We only pray it doesn't forget again. And then he walked out. There were no standing ovations, no applause, no camera flash that could capture the kind of justice that doesn't parade itself. As Malik stepped into the hallway, the world outside seemed too bright. His hand reached into his coat pocket, instinctively searching for the letter his mother had written him long ago, the one she slipped into his bag the day he left for law school. It wasn't there, but the words echoed anyway. Survive with grace, speak when it matters, and never, never let silence mean agreement. He sat on a bench beneath a window that filtered in the fading afternoon sun. For the first time in days, he exhaled fully, not as a strategist or investigator or attorney, but as a man who once stood in handcuffs for the crime of walking home. His mind wandered not backward but inward. He thought of the people who never got a room like this, the ones who were bruised and forgotten, who were told quietly and violently that their pain was not worth a file. He thought of how long systems resist accountability, and how deeply injustice roots itself into policies, mindsets, habits. And he thought about how easy it could have been to become bitter, to use his power to punish, not correct. But that wasn't the point. Malik didn't fight so others could kneel before him. He fought so no one would have to kneel again. Justice, he realized, was not a courtroom decision. It was a thread pulled gently through the lives of those who kept going anyway, even when unseen, even when doubted, even when their only weapon was a name that refused to disappear from the record. He looked up as the hallway began to empty. The sun touched the edges of the tiled floor. For a moment, everything was quiet, not because there was nothing left to say, but because something had finally been said. And it had been heard. This isn't over, but it's a start. He had almost forgotten about that night. The rookie was only 2 weeks into his assignment when it happened, barely out of academy training, still memorizing codes, still unsure how much to question orders. His name wasn't mentioned in any report, and perhaps that was by design. Officer Walker had only needed a signature, just a small revision to the body cam log. A timing error, Walker said. Make it cleaner. That's how he'd phrased it. Not lie, not cover it up, just clean. And the rookie, shaken, tired, and still worried about making the wrong move, had done it. No one ever followed up. No alarms went off. The paperwork vanished into the system like everything else. But today was different. Today the department felt different, quieter, uneasy, like it had seen itself in the mirror and wasn't sure who was looking back. He walked into the archive room alone. No one had asked him to go there. No one was watching. Still, his hands shook as he pulled the case file from the drawer. There it was, his initials, his small lie at the bottom of the page. One line, a timestamp. But that one line had helped a man like Walker stay untouchable for another year. He took a breath and began to correct it. The original footage, the accurate time, the discrepancies in the incident log. He refiled it under amended review, signed it again, this time with the truth. It didn't feel like a grand gesture. There were no trumpets, no one clapped. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead like they always did, but something felt steady, like gravity had adjusted itself by just a degree. As he stepped out of the room, he headed toward the restroom, needing to splash some water on his face. But when he looked up at the mirror above the sink, something made him pause. There was a note, not official, just taped gently to the corner of the mirror. A single line written in black marker on brown paper. Someone is always watching. MD, his throat tightened. He hadn't spoken to Malik Dorsey. He barely knew more than what was in the news. But somehow the message landed exactly where it needed to. Not like a warning, more like a reminder that truth didn't need witnesses to matter, that someone somewhere had noticed. Outside the station, news vans had begun to line the curb. The press conference was over, but reporters still hovered, voices rising over one another as they speculated. Would the state attorney general get involved? Would civil lawsuits follow? Had this opened the door to a broader investigation? CNN ran a segment that evening titled "Justice in Silence, the Man Who Didn't Shout." Meanwhile, a local op-ed declared, "When the badge bends but doesn't break." Social media picked up Malik's final words and ran them across black and white photos of courtrooms and raised hands. The story was spreading, but the heart of it remained in quiet gestures. Not everyone celebrated. Some officers grumbled in corners. Some blogs called it political theater. But for the rookie, one quiet choice, one amended line in a report, it meant everything. Because he knew how close he'd come to normalizing the lie. How easy it would have been to let it go. Later that week, he found himself walking past the board in the briefing room. The whiteboard usually held shift rotations or safety updates, but someone had written something new across the top. A system changes one honest act at a time. No name, no signature, but he smiled. He didn't need credit. He didn't need to be the hero. He just needed to remember what truth felt like when you chose it alone, quiet, uncelebrated, but clean. And that was enough. He didn't say goodbye to many people. Malik Dorsey wasn't the kind to linger. He left the city just before sunrise when the streets were still empty and the buildings still half asleep. The sky above was a soft gray with only the faintest hint of light pushing at the edge of the horizon. In the passenger seat beside him was a slim leather folder sealed, labeled, and meant for eyes that had never expected to be watched. There was no ceremony, no parade, no handshake from the mayor, just the steady hum of tires on wet asphalt and the quiet rustle of paper when the folder shifted with the turn. Where he was going, people wouldn't know his name. And that in some ways made the work easier, cleaner. Because this had never been about fame or power. It was never about catching someone in the act just to punish them. It was about noticing patterns, uncovering silence, teaching institutions to remember the pain they tried to forget. As the road stretched ahead, Malik's voice returned, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, thoughtful. Like he was speaking to someone beside him, or maybe to the version of himself that once believed survival meant keeping your head down. Justice, he said, was never about making a scene. It's about changing the atmosphere, so that next time someone doesn't have to ask for air. He passed a sign for the small town, nothing remarkable. A place where no one would expect a quiet man in a suit to walk into a county courthouse with a folder that could shake a few pillars loose. But he would, just like he had before. He'd sit in the back, take notes, listen too carefully. Not as a threat, but as a mirror. In the end, it was never about Walker and Burns. They were symptoms, not the illness. The illness was comfort, the kind that tells a system it's okay to forget the cost of its silence, the kind that builds thick walls and calls them protection, the kind that whispers to the next officer, just follow protocol even when protocol is poison. Malik had spent years understanding that kind of comfort. He had watched it bury truth under forms and wrap cruelty in polite language. And still he had stayed gentle, not soft, gentle. There's a difference. Gentleness, he believed, was the most radical form of power, the kind that didn't need to shout, the kind that could look someone in the eye and say, I see you, and I expect better. As the engine hummed beneath him, he thought about the rookie, the one who changed the record with no applause. He thought about Jenny Huynh risking her badge to speak one truth. He thought about his mother's voice in that cold detention room, whispering, just survive, and how survival for him had turned into something so much greater. It had turned into a legacy, because justice doesn't live in a courtroom or a headline. It lives in repetition, in systems learning new reflexes, in bad habits being broken one act at a time. It lives in the eyes of someone who's seen too much and still chooses to watch more carefully. He pulled up to a modest building with a flickering courthouse sign and turned off the engine. For a moment, he sat still listening to the quiet. He reached over and picked up the folder, tucking it neatly under his arm. Then he said almost to himself, the goal was never punishment. It was prevention. Quiet justice doesn't echo, it resonates. And with that, Malik Dorsey stepped out of the car and walked into another day that might never remember his name, but would feel the shape he left behind. Because sometimes the greatest victories don't leave a scar. They leave a standard. Thank you for staying with us through Malik Dorsey's quiet but powerful journey. This story wasn't just about injustice, it was about integrity, about what it means to hold your ground when no one's clapping, about the strength it takes to fix a broken system, not with noise, but with quiet, persistent courage. Malik didn't seek revenge, he sought reform, and sometimes that's the harder path. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on how real change begins, please give it a like. Share it with someone who believes in justice that doesn't shout, but still speaks volumes. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful narratives that challenge the system and celebrate the human spirit. Your support means the world to our creative team. It fuels us to keep telling stories that matter, stories that stay with you long after the screen fades. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. He told her to leave the courtroom, called her out like she was nobody. But what he didn't know was that she had come to investigate him, Amara Cole, silent and sharp, was sent by the government to expose the kind of justice that looks the other way when the defendant is black. She didn't raise her voice. She just listened. And when the time came, she stood. But when power is blind and pride runs deep, will the system listen before it collapses on itself? What happens when the woman you humiliate walks back in, not as a witness, but as the one sent to judge you? If that made your heart beat a little faster, tap like and share this story. Now come see what happens when silence walks back into the courtroom. They said court was open to the public, but somehow that didn't apply to her. It was 9:02 a.m. when she stepped into courtroom 3B. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Just walked in like someone who had every right to be there, but also knew most people would think otherwise. She wore a navy blue sweater, khaki pants, and soft-soled shoes that barely made a sound. No badge, no briefcase, only a slim black notebook held calmly in her hands. She took a seat 3 rows back, close enough to see the judge's face, far enough to blend in. Her name for today was Anna Davis, and no one needed to know more. The room buzzed with morning tension. Lawyers leaned in, whispering to clients. The hum of the HVAC competed with the shuffle of case files and the scratch of worn heels against polished tile. Then came the voice. All rise. Judge Ernest Wilcox entered with the gravity of a man who had ruled this courtroom longer than some of the officers outside had been alive. Robe crisp, chin high, gaze sharp. He sat, the court settled. The first case, a young black man charged with resisting arrest. His wrists were still red from the cuffs. His lawyer, a public defender who looked no older than 30, stood to make an argument about use of force. Wilcox waved him off. Let's save the speeches for someone who's buying them, counselor. The facts are clear. He ran, he struggled. Let's proceed. No one flinched. Not the jury, not the bailiff, not the boy's mother, who clutched a tissue like it was a lifeline, except one woman. Quietly, she wrote something down in her notebook. The judge noticed. At first, just a flicker of annoyance, then irritation. He squinted at her. You there? Yes, you. In the blue sweater. Heads turned. Even the defendant looked up. Amara lifted her eyes, steady, polite. Yes, Your Honor. Who are you here with, counsel media? I'm just observing, sir. Her voice was calm, low, clear as glass, but it only made him bristle more. Well, this isn't a lecture hall, and I don't need activists scribbling notes and staring like this is a protest trial. A few murmurs rippled in the back. If you want to play activist, he added, there's a park across the street. This is a court of law. Amara didn't blink. She closed her notebook with quiet precision, stood without a word, and nodded once. Understood. She turned and walked toward the exit, no hurry, no shame. But every pair of eyes followed her. Not for what she said, but for what she didn't. The silence she left behind spoke louder than any outburst. A middle-aged woman near the back, white floral blouse, silver hair, shook her head ever so slightly, lips pursed. The bailiff looked down, avoiding Wilcox's eyes. Even the boy on trial watched the door long after it closed, as if something important had just left and might not come back. Wilcox tapped his gavel. Let's move on. But for the rest of that morning, he kept glancing at the third row, at the space where she had been. And for a man so used to control, it was the first time in years something felt off. It wasn't the first time someone told her to leave a room she had every right to be in, but this time she let them. Because this time the room wasn't the goal, the system was. 2 blocks away from the courthouse, in a small second-floor office that used to be a tax service, Amara Cole sat behind a dusty wooden desk with no nameplate. The window blinds were cracked. The air smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner. But none of that mattered. She preferred it that way, plain, quiet, forgettable. On the file cabinet behind her was a metal badge. Federal seal. Office of the Inspector General. Trung Tencha Dakbiet. Botu Fapwaki. But no one in that courtroom had seen it, and she intended to keep it that way. Amara Cole wasn't here for titles. She was here to watch. And what she saw that morning told her everything she needed to know. She sat still, replaying the moment in her mind. Wilcox's voice, his tone, his assumption that her silence meant insignificance. It wasn't rage she felt. Not anymore. That had burned out years ago. Now what remained was purpose. Cold, precise, unshakable. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thin manila folder. On the tab in black marker, E.J. Turner, 14, deceased. His photo was still clipped to the front. Big eyes, soft jawline. A kid. gunned down in a police chase after being accused of stealing a sandwich and a bottle of juice from a corner store. Witnesses said he was unarmed. The officer's body cam mysteriously malfunctioned. The prosecutor never filed charges. The judge dismissed the wrongful death motion as lacking sufficient grounds. The judge was Wilcox. Amara didn't know E.J. Turner, but she'd met too many like him boys whose names live longer on hashtags than they did in real life. This case was the reason she said yes when the Attorney General called. That and what happened the last time she said no. 3 years ago, she uncovered a ring of falsified evidence in a Midwest DA's office. 4 convictions overturned, 3 officers indicted. The victory made headlines. So did the death threats. They found her car tires slashed in her driveway. A red X sprayed on her apartment door. They never caught who did it. After that, Amara stopped showing up to courtrooms in heels and suits. She stopped announcing who she was. And she learned that power wasn't in speaking louder. It was in being the last one left standing after everyone else thought you were gone. That's why she walked out of courtroom 3B with her head high and her notebook closed. That's why she didn't correct the judge when he called her activist. And that's why she was here now reviewing every ruling Wilcox had made in the last 7 years. She had already flagged 12 cases where black defendants were given maximum sentencing despite mitigating circumstances. 9 where key evidence was dismissed without hearing. 5 where officers accused of excessive force were cleared in under 2 hours. It was a pattern, and it was personal. Her eyes drifted back to the window where the sun was now spilling in crooked lines across the floor. She could still hear the courtroom door closing behind her, not as a failure, but as a beginning. The real work had started, and this time she wasn't walking back in alone. The hardest part wasn't finding the corruption. It was finding someone willing to admit it was there. The message came through the secure line on a Wednesday afternoon. 1 sentence, no name. Meet me behind the records room. After hours, I'll leave the door open. It was typed like a whisper, the kind that only comes from someone who's already looked over their shoulder twice. Amara waited until 7:15 p.m. The courthouse was nearly empty, the echo of her footsteps swallowed by high ceilings and cheap tile. She slipped down the back hallway past portraits of retired judges and glass cabinets filled with outdated law books. The records room was dark. A door on the far side creaked open an inch. Inside stood a woman in a faded gray cardigan, her hair tied back tight, eyes darting like a sparrow trapped in a box. Her name was Lana Price, a court clerk with 17 years of service and a memory like a steel trap. She didn't waste time. I don't know who you really are, she whispered, but I've seen you watching, and I think I know why you're here. Amara didn't respond. She let Lana speak. Wilcox, he doesn't tell people what to write. He doesn't have to. He rolls his eyes when a black attorney walks in and mumbles things under his breath. One time he threw out a motion before reading it, said, "Not wasting time on street logic." Lana swallowed hard. I typed the order. I didn't say anything. I needed the job. I still do. She handed Amara a USB stick. No words, no justification. Just a quiet offering the way people pass notes when they're not sure if speaking out loud will get them fired. Or worse. Amara nodded gently. No judgment, no promises, only respect. The next day, she reached out to a name buried deep in her contact list. Martin Hayes, a former prosecutor now working private defense. They'd gone to school together. Different coasts, different dreams. She went into justice. He went into comfort. He picked up on the second ring. Amara, he said, half surprised, half cautious. Been a long time. I need someone to talk, she said. There was a long pause. You want me to go on record against Wilcox? I want the truth. The truth costs, he said softly. More than I'm willing to pay. She waited. You think I don't want to, he added. I've seen him throw away families like broken pencils. But I've got twins. Private school, mortgage, clients who don't want headlines. You want justice, fine. But don't ask me to burn everything I've built to prove a point. Amara exhaled. It didn't surprise her, but it still hurt. After the call ended, she sat alone in that plain office, listening to the traffic outside, the slow hum of life that just kept moving no matter what broke inside it. She turned the USB drive in her fingers. Lana's voice echoed in her mind. I didn't say anything. I still need the job. And she thought of all the people who had seen, known, heard, but stayed quiet. Not because they didn't care, but because they thought it wouldn't matter. Or worse, because they thought no one would stand with them if they spoke. That was the power of the system Wilcox built. Not brute force, but quiet fear. a fear that spread slow and invisible, like a crack under glass. But that was also where it could break. Amara didn't come to put one man on trial. She came to show people that the rot wasn't invincible, that silence wasn't the only way to survive, that truth once spoken didn't just expose what was broken. It dared others to speak too. She opened her laptop, inserted the drive, and began to read. She didn't sneak in this time. No more blue sweater. No more hiding behind a crowd. On the morning she returned to courtroom 3B, Amara Cole walked through the front doors in a charcoal gray suit, her hair tied back, heels clicking in calm, even rhythm. A soft gold badge hung from her neck. The name on it clear and unmistakable, Amara Cole, Office of the Inspector General. She wasn't trying to blend in anymore, and people noticed. The bailiff straightened when she passed. A young clerk dropped her pen. One of the court security guards whispered to another, "That's her, isn't it? The one from D.C." By the time Amara took her seat, same row third from the front, the energy in the room had shifted. The judge hadn't entered yet, but already silence hung heavier than usual. 2 seats behind her, a junior clerk named Devin held his phone under the bench and texted quietly, "She's back. Suit this time. Name badge says Amara Cole." That Amara Cole. He didn't send it to the press. He sent it to the court administrator. 30 seconds later, a notification buzzed inside the judge's chambers. When Wilcox stepped into the room, his eyes scanned quickly, then stopped. There she was, back again. Same seat, but this time she wasn't a mystery. She was a message. He blinked once, then continued walking, robe flowing behind him like nothing had changed. But something had. He sat down. The gavel hit wood. The courtroom came to order. "Let's proceed," he said. "We're already running behind." But his voice had a hitch in it. Just a hairline crack, not enough for most people to notice. Amara did. The first case was routine, a civil complaint, landlord dispute. But Wilcox kept glancing at the gallery, stealing quick looks at the woman with the badge. She never looked back. She just took notes. Calm, precise, unshaken. "Ms. Cole," he said during a pause without looking at her, "if you're here in any official capacity, I hope you've coordinated with the court." She closed her notebook and looked up steady and measured. "I'm simply observing, Your Honor. You said this courtroom was no place for activists. I assume it still welcomes oversight." The room held its breath. Wilcox smiled, thin, tight. "Of course, we have nothing to hide." But his hand tightened on the edge of the bench. He moved through the rest of the docket quickly, more abrupt than usual. At one point, he cut off a defense attorney mid-sentence and dismissed the motion without comment. The attorney, confused, glanced toward Amara like maybe the air had changed and he hadn't been told. In the back, someone scribbled notes with a little more urgency. The buzz spread quietly from the clerk's table to the hallway outside to the city's legal grapevine. She's here for him. That woman isn't just watching. She's watching him. By noon, Wilcox called for an early recess. Lunch break. Back in 90 minutes. He stood too fast, nearly knocked over his water glass, caught it, recovered. Walked out with his chin high, but his back a little too straight, like a man suddenly aware he's being watched from behind. Amara stayed in her seat for a moment after he left. She didn't move, didn't speak. Then slowly she stood, adjusted her badge, and walked out, same calm, same rhythm, as if she had all the time in the world. Because she did. She wasn't chasing him. She was waiting, and he was starting to know it. The summons came without warning. Just after 1 Haru p.m. in the middle of Wilcox's second afternoon case, a court officer approached the bench and handed him a folded note. He opened it, read it twice, then cleared his throat. "Recess. I'll return shortly." No explanation. No eye contact. He stood turned and walked out with a stiffness that didn't match his usual pace. The hallway outside was quiet, too quiet. He was led not to his chambers, but down a back corridor, past the conference rooms and deposition suites, to an interior meeting room that hadn't been used in months. Neutral walls, no windows. Just a rectangular table, 6 chairs, and one woman already sitting there. She didn't rise. She didn't smile. She was wearing the same satus as earlier that morning, but now the badge that had dangled from her neck was laid flat on the table in front of her. Federal gold, department seal, Office of the Inspector General, Senior Inspector Amara Cole. Wilcox hesitated at the door, only for a second. Then he walked in and closed it behind him. "Ms. Cole, Judge Wilcox." Her voice wasn't cold. It was steady, controlled. The kind of voice that had already decided what would and wouldn't be said. "I wasn't informed of any inquiry." He began, taking a seat opposite of her. "That's intentional," she replied. He raised an eyebrow, the faintest attempt at defiance. "You could have simply introduced yourself in court." Amara looked at him calmly. I did. You told me to leave your courtroom, so now, she slid a manila folder across the table. I'm here to review how you've run it. He opened it. Inside were transcripts, flagged rulings, annotated notes, and 3 signed affidavits. One from a former court clerk, one from a public defender, and one he saw the name and paused was from a retired prosecutor. You've been building this, he muttered. Amara didn't respond. She let the weight of the evidence speak for itself. So what's the endgame, he asked. You want me to apologize, resign? What is this? This, she said quietly, is accountability. He leaned back, arms crossed. You have no idea the pressure we're under, the backlog, the media noise, the public wanting justice in headlines, not in law. You sit behind a desk and judge what we do in real time. You're right, she said, interrupting gently. I don't know your pressures, but I know this. She reached for the remote and turned on a small monitor mounted to the side wall. Video footage. Silent. Courtroom 3B, 2 years ago. A black teenager on trial, nervous, speaking softly. Wilcox leaning forward, voice raised, hand slamming down. There was no sound, but you didn't need it. The body language said enough. You called him street trash, under oath. He stared at the screen. You destroyed his testimony, not because of facts, but because of how he looked, how he spoke, and who you assumed he was. Silence hung between them. Amara let it. We all have biases, she continued, but when you sit where you sit, they aren't just thoughts, they're consequences. Wilcox said nothing. This is not a witch hunt. I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here because you've forgotten who that bench belongs to. She leaned in just slightly. No anger, just clarity. It belongs to the people, all of them. He looked away, eyes resting on the closed folder, hands still, mouth drawn tight. For once, he didn't have a ruling. No objection, no gavel to bang, no bailiff to back him up. Just the truth. And a woman who had been ordered to leave his courtroom, now sitting across from him, holding his future in her hands. He didn't slam the door behind him. That would have shown too much. When Judge Wilcox left the meeting room, his steps were sharp, his shoulders high, the practiced posture of a man refusing to look shaken. But something in his eyes had shifted. The hallway felt colder, the silence tighter. He didn't return to the bench, not right away. Instead, he walked past his chamber, down the hall into a small office labeled Judicial Liaison Only. He closed the door gently, then sat at the edge of the desk like he didn't quite trust the chair to hold him. And then he pulled out his phone. There weren't many numbers he still called directly, but this one Senator Raymond Trask, veteran lawmaker, longtime ally, and frequent recipient of Wilcox's holiday scotch, had always picked up on the first ring. This time it rang 4 times before a voice answered. Ray Wilcox said, keeping his voice low, "We have a problem." There was a pause, then the senator's voice clipped and cautious. "I've heard. This Inspector Cole she's here with files affidavits video. This isn't just some internal slap on the wrist. She's building a case." Another pause. "She's not building anything, Ernest. She's already built it. And from what I hear, she didn't come to ask for favors." Wilcox leaned forward. "So we fight it. We get ahead of it. I can call in a few press contacts, float the idea this is politically motivated, say she's targeting conservative judges, overstepping her bounds." Trask sighed. "Ernest, come on, Ray. You and I both know how these things work. A couple of strong headlines, maybe a leaked memo." Ernest, stop. The line went quiet for a moment. Then the senator spoke again, softer now. "She's not some activist blogger. She was handpicked. Presidential appointment. You think I'm going to run interference against someone the White House is backing publicly? You think I'd burn my seat for you?" Wilcox's jaw clenched. "So that's it. You're leaving me out to dry." "No," Trask said. "I'm telling you to shut the windows before the house burns down. Take the early retirement. Write a memoir. Let it blow over. And let her paint me as the villain." "You did that yourself?" The line went dead. Wilcox stared at the phone like it had betrayed him. For a long moment, he just sat there. The room was still. The old clock on the wall ticked too loudly. He remembered the early days, the praise, the invitations to speak, the look of gratitude on victims' families when he handed down a harsh sentence. He believed for years that firmness was justice. That tone meant authority. That instinct meant truth. And now, those same instincts were being printed out as evidence. He called 2 more people, a longtime court liaison, a friend in the state bar. Both answered. Both gave polite condolences. Neither offered help. He wasn't being abandoned. He was being quietly left behind. When he finally returned to chambers, the coffee on his desk was cold. A clerk passed him a folder and avoided his eyes. Wilcox sat, opened the folder, tried to read the next case, but the words wouldn't stay still. Because now for the first time he wasn't sure who was watching. Which whisper in the hallway was about him? Which glance wasn't just respect, but recognition? The bench hadn't moved, but the ground beneath it had shifted. There are cases that never make the news. No headlines, no hashtags, just a court number on a yellowed folder, and a boy whose name fades faster than the ink on the page. Jalen Whitmore, 14. He was caught inside a parked car behind a convenience store. No weapon, no theft charges filed against him for anything of value. Just a few snacks half-eaten. The store clerk had waved it off, said he looked scared, not dangerous. But the arrest still happened. The charges still stuck. And the courtroom still moved on like it always did. Wilcox gave him 6 months in juvenile detention. He didn't ask why Jalen was stealing food. He didn't ask what hunger looked like on a child's face. He just read the file, shook his head once, and called him a repeat in the making. Amara remembered writing those words. She had read a lot of court transcripts. Too many. But that phrase stayed with her. It wasn't the harshest thing she'd seen on paper, not by far, but it was the kind that told her exactly how much a boy's future was worth in that room. This morning, that case file sat open on the long wooden table in front of Wilcox. Amara stood at the far end, calm, composed, as 2 senior judges from the state's oversight committee listened. There were no TV cameras, not yet, but there were recorders on the table, and enough eyes in the room to know this was not just a review, it was a reckoning. Your Honor, Amara began, her voice steady. This is a request for emergency case reconsideration under federal supervision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had the words and the weight of what they meant. She detailed the gaps, the missed context, the neglected background, the silent assumptions. She didn't need to dramatize anything. The facts already did that. Wilcox listened in silence, his fingers laced together tightly, pressing so hard his knuckles paled. When she placed the original sentencing transcript on the table and opened it to the paragraph that held those 5 words, a repeat, in the making, he looked at them like they were someone else's handwriting. But they weren't, and he knew it. This boy, Amara said quietly, was hungry. That was his crime, and we treated him like he was already lost. The room stayed quiet for a long beat. Then she pushed forward a clean petition already signed by the public defender, the state-appointed advocate, and the Office of Juvenile Justice. Just one signature left. She slid the pen across the table. Wilcox stared at it, the most powerful man in that courtroom for 2 decades now, unsure if he could trust his own hand not to shake. And then he signed. No speech, no defense, just ink on paper, and the weight of what it meant. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, the sky was overcast, but the sidewalk felt brighter somehow. No protest banners, no shouting, just a few people standing together quietly, a teacher from Jalen's old school, a neighbor who used to slip him granola bars, a mother holding her daughter's hand. A local reporter stepped toward an older woman wrapped in a faded blue scarf. Ma'am, what does this moment mean to you? She didn't answer right away. She looked up at the building, at the windows where things finally seemed to be shifting, then back at the reporter. She didn't just give that kid justice, she said softly. She gave the rest of us a reason to believe again. Upstairs, Amara stood behind the window. She didn't wave, didn't smile. But her shoulders, they dropped just slightly, like someone finally letting go of something they'd carried far too long. It didn't start with the press conference. It started with a phone shaking in someone's hand. A recording, short, grainy, taken from the gallery of courtroom 3B. Just 2 voices, a few lines of dialogue, and the moment when Amara Cole stood up, closed her notebook, and walked out without a word. It was uploaded to a small local news page, no headline, just a caption. She never raised her voice. By noon the next day, the video had been shared over 100,000 times. By nightfall, it was on every major platform. People didn't just watch it. They watched it twice. And then again. They paused at her stillness. They rewound to the judge's tone. They commented on the way she carried herself, not with outrage, but with something heavier, like dignity sharpened by years of silence. Then came the hashtags. Justice has a face. She stood, a courtroom free. And then came the stories. Not from pundits, not from politicians, but from people. Ordinary invisible people who had sat in courtrooms, in classrooms, in waiting rooms, being told by words or looks or protocol that they didn't belong. A former foster youth wrote, "I was 11 when a judge laughed while I cried. Watching her stand made something in me sit taller. A retired nurse posted, "I've been dismissed in courtrooms just for wearing scrubs. But that woman, she reminded me, we don't need volume to be heard." And then one comment under a clip with 2 million views was pinned to the top. She didn't shout, she stood. And it was louder than any protest I've seen. The name under the comment, Marcus Leroy, exonerated last year after serving 12 years for a crime he didn't commit under a ruling originally handed down by Judge Wilcox. His words traveled like wind under a locked door. They found their way into podcasts, morning shows, editorials. But no one turned it into a headline because it didn't need one. It had already become something else. Not a scandal, not a takedown, but a shift. Quiet, measured, irreversible. People didn't just talk about Amara Cole. They remembered her. And more than that, they began to look differently at the rooms they used to sit in, silently courtrooms, school board meetings, even waiting areas in government buildings. They started to ask questions, not loudly but clearly, because sometimes change doesn't start with a roar. It starts when one person stands, and stays standing long after they've left the room. He wore the same robe, same polished shoes, same stiff posture. But when Wilcox walked into the closed door hearing that morning, something was different. He wasn't announced. There was no gavel. No one stood when he entered. The long wooden table stretched before him, lined with faces he once called colleagues. A few judges, a state ethics officer, one representative from the Attorney General's office, and at the far end, Amara Cole. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't even look at him right away. Just continued writing something in her folder like he was another name, another file to be reviewed. Wilcox took his seat. The chair creaked louder than expected. He cleared his throat as if preparing to speak, an instinct formed over decades. But the woman seated to his right raised a hand. "You've been asked to listen, only Judge Wilcox. This is not a defense proceeding." That word judge landed awkwardly, not quite fitting anymore. What followed wasn't a trial, it wasn't hostile, it was colder than that. They read findings, they listed dates, they referenced testimonies and footage and tone. But the most powerful thing in the room, was silence. No outrage, no yelling, just evidence layered like bricks around him, too many to step over, too late to undo. And Wilcox, he sat motionless. A man who had once commanded rooms with a glance, now couldn't meet a single eye. At one point, someone offered him a chance to submit a written statement. He nodded but said nothing. And that was the shift. Not when he lost his title, but when he lost his words. Later that afternoon, a one-page notice was posted outside the courthouse clerk's office. Effective immediately, Judge Ernest Wilcox has chosen to retire from the bench. No further comment. It didn't need more. By then, most had already seen what they needed to see. The man who had once dismissed voices with a gavel was now walking out of the building without a sound. Outside, a small group of court employees stood quietly near the steps. Some nodded. Some said nothing. But most just watched, not out of celebration, but out of something closer to relief. Wilcox didn't look up as he passed them, didn't wave, didn't speak. His robe folded under one arm, his briefcase dragging slightly behind. He disappeared down the sidewalk like a shadow leaving its shape. Upstairs, Amara stood alone in the hallway facing the old portraits of retired judges. She looked at each frame for a moment, eyes scanning the names, and then stopped at one that hadn't yet been removed. Wilcox's. The photo was still fresh. He was younger in it, chin high, eyes full of control. She didn't touch the frame, didn't need to. A junior clerk approached her, hesitating before speaking. "Ms. Cole, it's done." Amara nodded once, then finally looked up at the wall, not with pride, but with something deeper. Understanding. Stillness. "Power isn't loud," she said softly. "Real power listens." And with that, she turned and walked down the hall, quiet, steady, leaving behind only silence and the weight of something that had finally shifted. The courthouse steps had never looked so quiet. No media vans, no banners, just sunlight slanting across the concrete, catching the dust in the air like flecks of gold. Amara stepped out slowly, her heels making a soft rhythm against the stone. She wasn't in a rush. The weight of what had just happened still hung on her shoulders, not heavy but full. She paused at the top step, exhaled, closed her eyes for just a breath. And when she opened them, she saw them. Not a crowd, just a small cluster of people gathered at the bottom of the steps. A few familiar faces, some she'd seen in hearings, some who had simply come to see if change could wear a name they recognized. And among them, A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, clutching a juice box in one hand and her mother's fingers in the other. She was staring, not scared, not shy, just watching. Amara met her gaze and smiled, a quiet curve of the mouth, not the kind for photographs. And then the little girl leaned close to her mother and whispered, though her voice still carried, "Mom, is she the judge now?" Her mother didn't look surprised by the question. She looked proud, and maybe just a little choked up. She bent down, brushed the girl's curls back behind her ear and said, "No, baby. She's the one who makes the judges think twice." Amara heard it, and for a moment she almost stopped walking. Not because of the words, but because of the truth in them. She didn't respond, didn't correct, didn't explain. She just kept moving, down the steps, past the people, through the light. And as she passed the edge of the building, the sun caught her just right, casting a soft halo over her shoulders, as if even the sky had decided to take note. No one clapped. No one called her name. But every head turned, and every heart stilled just a little. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with applause. It comes with the kind of silence that feels like truth settling into place. And a little girl years from now will remember the day she saw a woman walk out of a courthouse, not with victory, but with grace. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that never had to raise its tone. This story wasn't about revenge or noise. It was about quiet strength, about standing firm when the world expects you to sit down. It was about justice, yes, but more than that, it was about dignity and how that alone can move mountains. If this story moved you even just a little, please take a second to like this video, share it with someone who still believes in doing what's right, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful stories that don't just entertain, but stay with you. Your support isn't just a number. It's the reason we keep telling stories that matter. And with every click, every comment, every share, you're helping us shine a light on voices that deserve to be heard. From all of us here at Mr. Max Stories, thank you for listening, for believing, and for being part of something bigger than just a video. We'll see you in the next story. All Monica wanted was a fair hearing for her son. Instead, she was shoved, insulted, and humiliated by a white cop who had no clue she was the CIA director's wife. What would you do if the system tried to bury you not knowing you came with a shovel? If that made your heart skip hit-like and follow along? This is where her quiet revenge began. That morning, the courthouse didn't feel like a place for truth. It felt like a stage, and the show had already started before Monica Fields and her 13-year-old son even stepped through the doors. People in the hallway weren't whispering out of curiosity. They were whispering because they believed they already knew everything they needed to know. And to them, Monica wasn't a mother seeking fairness. She was a story they'd read, a headline they'd repeated. Mason walked close beside her, his blazer slightly too big, his sneakers clean but worn. He kept his eyes low, his steps small. He was trying not to exist more than necessary. Monica held his hand, not tightly, just enough to remind him, "You're not alone, and you don't have to carry this by yourself." The accusations against Mason had spread fast. Black teen attacks, white officer's son, that's what the media called it. They didn't print the part where Mason had stepped in to defend another student, a smaller boy who was being mocked for his accent. They didn't mention that Landon Grayson, the so-called victim, had been the one throwing the first words loud and cruel. But none of that made the news. It didn't fit the story. So now here they were, mother and son, walking into a room where justice was supposed to be blind, but somehow had already made up its mind. Officer Natalie Grayson stood just inside the security checkpoint. Her uniform was pressed, crisp hair pulled back to perfection, eyes sharp and steady. She wasn't supposed to be there. As the mother of the so-called victim, she had no business being on duty. But no one seemed to mind. She stood with the confidence of someone who knew rules didn't apply the same way to everyone. As Monica approached, Grayson raised her eyes slowly, letting them settle on Mason first, then on Monica. "You got paperwork?" she asked casually, too casually. Monica opened her bag, wordless. She handed over the forms. The court noticed Mason's birth certificate. Grayson barely glanced at them. "This your boy?" she asked, even though she already knew. Monica nodded. Grayson leaned in, a little voice low enough that it could pass for polite. "He's smaller than I pictured. Guess stories make people bigger." There was a moment. Monica could have said something, could have pushed back, but she didn't. Instead, she looked her straight in the eye just for a beat. And in that stillness, Monica said everything she needed to without uttering a word. Grayson stepped aside. "Good luck in there," she said with something almost like a smile. "You'll need it." Monica led Mason forward. Inside the courtroom, the air was stiff, like the kind of quiet that hums after thunder, but before the lightning reaches the ground. The benches were full, not with family or friends, but with people who came to watch. A story was playing out in real time, and they were here for the spectacle. As Monica and Mason took slow steps down the aisle, the room shifted. Heads turned. Words floated behind them like smoke. "That's her. Is that the boy?" They always come in looking innocent. Monica's jaw tightened. Mason's shoulders dropped. He stared at the floor, already too small for this room, and shrinking more with every step. She reached out, gently placed her hand on his back. Then she sat beside him, arranging papers that didn't need arranging, just to give her fingers something to do. Everything in this room was unfamiliar, unwelcoming. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the sentence had. It lived in the walls, the stairs, the silence that only got deeper when Monica looked up and saw Officer Grayson again, now seated at the back of the room, out of uniform, but just as sharp. Grayson's eyes were fixed on her. Not curious, not nervous, just waiting. Monica looked away, not down, not defeated, just away. She adjusted Mason's collar, then sat straight, both hands resting flat on the table. She didn't speak, because sometimes silence isn't fear. Sometimes it's the only kind of strength they won't see coming. They hadn't even called the case yet when it started. Monica had barely settled into the wooden bench beside her son when Officer Grayson appeared again, this time, walking straight down the center aisle like it was hers. Her uniform was gone, but her presence carried the same sharp edge. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd already decided where everyone belonged in the room and exactly where Monica did not. "Ma'am, this row's for legal guardians only," she said, standing over them like a storm cloud. Her voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'll have to ask you to move." Monica looked up slowly. "I am his mother." Grayson's eyebrows lifted as if that answer were somehow both expected and still offensive. "We've got rules. This seat is for active representation. If you're not an attorney, you need to step back." Monica's hands stayed folded in her lap. "He's 13. And this is a courtroom," Grayson snapped, louder this time. "Not a daycare." The room turned. Not all at once, but like a wave. Heads pivoted, eyes narrowed. Some leaned forward, eager for escalation. Others smirked into their sleeves. Monica stood slow and measured. She didn't argue, didn't match the volume, just stood and reached for her coat, moving aside so Mason wouldn't be caught in the shuffle. But as she bent to gather her bag, Grayson stepped in, sharply nudging the bench with her knee, not forceful enough to be called violence, but just hard enough that Monica lost balance and dropped sideways onto the seat. There was a moment, sharp and still, where no one spoke. Just the sound of a bag hitting the floor and the quiet intake of breath from a child who didn't yet understand how fast dignity can be stripped. Monica didn't look up. She straightened her coat. Then, with the most deliberate motion in the room, she reached into her collar and pressed one small button, the soft click of the recorder activating beneath her scarf. Grayson turned and walked back toward her place like nothing had happened. Monica sat back down in the next row just behind Mason. She didn't adjust her posture, didn't sigh. She simply folded her hands again and watched her son. The room buzzed behind her, but she was no longer interested in it. Mason turned around slowly, his eyes searching hers for some kind of explanation. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked scared, confused, and young. He whispered, "Why do they hate you so much?" Monica didn't answer, not right away. She placed a hand over his and held it there. There was warmth in her touch, but also restraint, the kind of stillness a person learns after years of being judged before they're spoken to. She leaned in close enough that only he could hear her. "You don't need to understand their hatred," she said quietly. "You only need to understand yourself." Mason nodded, but she could see it hadn't settled. Not yet. She didn't expect it to. Monica leaned back again, eyes forward, spine straight. There would be no apology, no explanation, no plea for decency from people who had already thrown it away. What happened a moment ago would never be written down in the court transcript. It wouldn't show up in the official record. But her recorder was running now, and so was time ticking, building, documenting everything they thought no one would remember. She sat there in silence. Not because she had nothing to say, but because they didn't deserve to hear it yet. Let them think she was weak. Let them think she had lost her footing. Because when you wait long enough, even a fall can become a weapon. The judge entered without ceremony. He adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and began reading the docket like it was just another routine. There was no pause, no acknowledgement of the eyes in the room or the weight of the moment. It was as if this were just a formality and Monica just another name on paper. She sat still, eyes forward, hands resting in her lap. Her scarf shifted slightly as she breathed. Beneath it, the small microphone pinned inside her collar remained active. Every word, every silence, every unchecked moment of bias, it was all being captured now. Officer Grayson was the first to be called. She stood quickly, confidently, and walked to the front with a kind of posture that didn't ask for permission. Her voice was calm at first, controlled. She explained the incident with clinical distance, but it didn't take long for the tone to change. She described Mason not as a student, but as a problem. She called him confrontational, volatile. She used the kind of language that cloaks accusation and policy, careful but cutting. She mentioned patterns of behavior and concerns for safety, but she never once spoke of the racial slur that started the fight. She never mentioned the boy Mason had defended. She didn't need to. The omission said everything. Monica listened. She didn't blink. She didn't fidget. She simply absorbed every word and stored it both in memory and in tape. Then Grayson turned slightly toward the judge and said what the room had been circling. This isn't just one boy with a bad temper. This is a reflection of what happens when certain communities don't hold their kids accountable. We've seen it before. We'll see it again. The room didn't gasp. No one objected. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and familiar. The judge said nothing. He scribbled a few notes and moved on. Monica's fingers curled slightly in her lap, but her face remained composed. Then the guidance counselor was called. She spoke softly with the air of someone trying to sound neutral. She used phrases like difficulty adapting and struggles with structured environments. She offered no details, no context, just language designed to imply failure without saying anything directly. Monica didn't respond. She wasn't surprised. This was the quiet part of the system, the one that smiles while it excludes. The one that sounds polite while still pointing fingers. Beside her, Mason barely moved. His shoulders were square, but his gaze stayed low. He was trying to stay still to not give them any more to twist. Monica wanted to reach for his hand, to tell him she was proud of him, but she didn't. She stayed steady because the moment demanded stillness more than comfort. The judge called for a short recess. The crowd exhaled. Some stood, some stretched, some leaned over to whisper. As Grayson walked past Monica's bench, she didn't look down, but her voice drifted just enough. She'll crack. They always do. Monica heard it, so did Mason. She didn't react. She adjusted the edge of her scarf with quiet precision. She didn't flinch or look up, just made sure the recorder was still going. She didn't need to crack. She didn't need to speak. They were doing the work for her, with every insult wrapped in procedure, with every assumption left unchallenged, with every silence from the bench. She let them build their own record, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen. And sometimes silence is not surrender. It's evidence. The judge returned from recess as if nothing in the room had shifted. He didn't look up when he sat, didn't glance toward Monica or Mason, just straightened a stack of papers and tapped the edge against the bench like tidying something that had never been messy to begin with. The prosecutor stood with a certain kind of ease, not aggressive, not hostile, just confident in a room where confidence always leaned in one direction. She adjusted her blazer and cleared her throat softly as though what she was about to say was just another logistical suggestion. Your Honor, given the nature of the child's behavior and the circumstances surrounding the incident, we recommend a psychological evaluation for the mother. She paused for effect. There are indications that poor supervision and unstable parenting may have contributed to the escalation. No gas followed. No objection rose. The suggestion hung in the air like something already agreed upon. The prosecutor didn't raise her voice, didn't point fingers. She didn't have to. The system had already trained itself to understand what wasn't being said out loud. The judge nodded. No questions. No clarification. He simply looked down, scribbled something onto the file in front of him, and said he would approve the request. There was no one in that room who had asked Monica what she thought. No one had turned to her. No one had even asked her to stand. Beside her, Mason shifted slightly, just a small movement, but Monica felt it like a tremor under her feet. He was trying to stay composed, but his hand trembled against the wooden bench. Monica placed her fingers gently on top of his. She didn't grip. She didn't squeeze. She just reminded him she was still there. She had known it would be like this, but knowing did not make it easier. Grayson remained seated near the front. When the judge gave her a brief nod, she stood. Her movements were practiced now. Her tone carried a smug composure. She didn't look at Monica when she spoke. She looked at the judge, at the audience, at the walls. She raised a threat. What did you expect from someone like her? It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The phrase carried its weight like a hidden blade. It was not just about Mason. It was about Monica, about what she looked like, where she came from, what they believed she represented. The courtroom didn't stir. No outrage, no surprise. It was a quiet kind of violence, the kind that lands with a smile. Monica didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on Grayson the whole time. Not wide with shock, not narrowed in anger. Just steady, deep, unmoving. She had been insulted before. She had been dismissed before. But this moment felt different, not because of what was said, but because of how many people in that room agreed with it just by staying silent. The judge didn't ask for clarification. He didn't rebuke the comment. He moved on to the next item like it had never been spoken. And still Monica said nothing. But inside her, something shifted. Not broken, not bruised, sharpened. She turned her gaze back to the bench. Her face remained composed. But her silence no longer felt like stillness. It felt like gathering, like the pause before thunder, like something unseen beginning to align. She thought of Mason beside her, of how much he had already learned just by sitting in that room, how quickly the world had shown him which voices mattered and which were optional, how clearly the law had drawn the line between what it said and what it meant. She let her fingers rest on the table now, not fidgeting, not clenched, just present, ready. The courtroom continued on as if nothing unusual had happened. Motions passed, statements were recorded. The machinery of procedure hummed steadily forward. But for Monica, the tone of the day had changed. They had written her off, and they had done it in public with confidence, with ease. They believed she was invisible. They believed she was finished, and that was their mistake, because they had just handed her exactly what she needed. Not permission, not sympathy. They had handed her a reason. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm, but Monica felt the edges tightening. She could sense the story narrowing, closing around her like a vice. The prosecutor kept her eyes on the files. The judge glanced at the clock more than he did at people. And behind them all, Grayson sat comfortably, like a woman who believed the hardest part was over. From the second row, someone leaned in just enough for their voice to carry. It wasn't loud and it wasn't intended to reach her, but it did. Where's the kid's father? The words weren't cruel. They weren't even said with malice, but they stung because they carried the kind of assumption that weighed heavier than insults. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict dressed as curiosity. Monica did not turn around. She didn't try to see who said it. She just let the question land and settle. Then after a moment, her voice cut through the quiet. He doesn't shout, but when he moves, things don't stay the same. There were no follow-up whispers, no gasps, no shifting in the pews. But something shifted anyway. Monica returned her gaze to the front of the room. Her posture never changed. Her tone had been soft but final. She hadn't said it to defend herself. She had said it because the truth didn't need an audience to exist. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Not to check messages, not to scroll. She unlocked the screen and opened her contacts. Her thumb hovered over one name, Elias. She stared at it for a long moment. Not thinking, not planning, just watching the name glow on the screen. A name that meant more than most people in that room would ever understand. She didn't press it. She let the screen go dark again. She wasn't ready. Not because she was afraid of what would happen, but because some moments require patience to be powerful. If she called now, it would be a reaction. She didn't want reaction. She wanted precision. Monica knew exactly what Elias was capable of. And more importantly, she knew how much he trusted her to act when she was ready. There had been a time when she would have called, already would have let the weight fall to someone else. But today was different. Today she had watched the system underestimate her in full view. Today she had let them talk, let them judge, let them decide. And today she had not broken. Mason shifted beside her. He didn't look at her phone, didn't ask what she was thinking. He was quiet in a way that wasn't fear anymore. It was learning. He was watching how to hold space without making noise. Monica reached into her coat pocket, not for her phone this time, but for a folded piece of paper she had written on that morning. It held no defense strategy, no names of witnesses, just one sentence she had written to herself before leaving the house. Let them see what they think they're seeing. She refolded it and tucked it back into the lining of her coat. The courtroom kept moving. The judge spoke. The prosecutor prepared another file. Everything on the surface looked exactly as it had before, but beneath it something had changed. They had started whispering about her, not with the same certainty as before. Now they were unsure, and that was enough. Because in rooms like this, power shifts not with shouting, but with silence that refuses to sink. There was a lull in the room, one of those quiet stretches where everyone knew the next move might shift something, even if they didn't quite know what. And just as the moment seemed ready to pass, Officer Grayson rose from her seat with a calm that was more calculated than composed, raising her voice just enough to be heard as she addressed the judge with a measured tone, requesting to make a few additional remarks framed as clarification. Although no one in the room seemed confused, the judge, without hesitation or a glance toward Monica, gave her the floor with the kind of indifferent nod that had become routine, and just like that, the space belonged to Grayson once again. She stood at the center like she had earned it, her spine straight, her voice steady, and as she began to speak, her words carried the polished weight of someone used to being heard, used to being trusted, used to defining what truth meant in a room built to record only one version of it. She began softly with language dressed in civility, explaining that in her years working closely with youth from difficult environments, she had seen behaviors, patterns, warning signs. And while she never said Mason's name, every syllable made it clear who she meant and what she thought he represented. Then she paused, not long enough for someone to object, but just enough to prepare her audience for the turn she was about to take. And when she spoke again, the change in tone was so subtle, it felt like a shift in temperature, not volume, as her gaze finally moved toward Monica and settled with intent. "What are you, a politician's girlfriend?" she asked with mock curiosity, as if it were a punchline she didn't expect anyone to laugh at, followed by a sentence that seemed to scrape against the walls of the courtroom as she continued, "You think you're special, just because you sit here quiet, crossing your legs like you belong." And then came the final strike, not shouted, not even emphasized, but somehow heavier than all the rest, when she said, "You're a nobody," like it was the end of a sentence and the closing of a case. The room went still, not in shock, but in a silence that knew better than to respond. The kind of silence that allows harm to echo just a little longer. And in that stillness, no one turned to Monica. No one stood for her. No one said a word. Monica, however, did not blink, did not shift, did not look away, because in that moment she understood something that Officer Grayson had clearly forgotten. Something that required no correction, no rebuttal, no raised voice, only the strength to remain exactly where she was. She held her gaze steady, her expression unreadable but far from hollow, because what she gave Grayson in that look was not anger or humiliation but clarity, the kind that reveals not who you are, but who the other person just revealed themselves to be. What Grayson did not know, could not possibly have known, was that she had just crossed a threshold, one that couldn't be undone or explained away, one that exposed more about herself than about Monica, and all of it happened in front of a room that had grown far too comfortable, watching a woman of dignity be tested for no other reason than that she refused to fold. The judge did not interrupt, and the prosecutor remained quiet. The clerk kept her eyes low, and in that silence, Monica's restraint became its own declaration, not a retreat, but a witness. Behind her, someone stirred, the kind of shift that happens when shame creeps in too late. But Monica didn't turn around, didn't allow the moment to dissolve into discomfort or pity, because she wasn't there to absorb anyone's guilt. She had come prepared for this. Not for the insult itself, but for what would follow, for what it would expose, for the way it would capture something no transcript could reflect. Grayson sat back down with a look of satisfaction, unaware that what she thought was victory was actually evidence, because in Monica's silence, something had taken shape, something patient, precise, and already in motion. She had said nothing. She had done nothing. But they had seen everything, and that would be enough. The courtroom had not yet recovered from the venom Grayson had just released. Her words still hung in the air unchallenged, as if they belonged there, as if no one in that room had the will to name what they had just witnessed. The judge glanced briefly at his notes. The prosecutor straightened a folder without looking up, and Monica remained still quiet and impossibly composed. Then, without warning, the doors opened. No loud knock, no formal announcement. Only the low creak of wood and a breath of cold air that moved through the space like a silent verdict. It wasn't the kind of chill that stung skin, but the kind that settled beneath it, the kind that reminded you of what power feels like when it walks into a room that has grown too used to abusing silence. Every head turned, not because of noise, but because the room had changed. Something unseen had shifted, and it drew the eyes of every person without permission, as if the atmosphere itself had decided to correct its balance. He entered with a stillness that commanded more attention than footsteps ever could. There was no flash of authority on his chest, no introduction called out ahead of him, no need for explanation. He walked like a man who knew the rules and had once written them, like someone who understood that real presence did not require performance. He didn't look left or right. He didn't slow down. He moved with purpose, with calm, with weight. Grayson turned slowly, her expression confused at first, then wary. She didn't know why yet, but her body had already recognized that the rules of the room were shifting beneath her. She leaned slightly toward the prosecutor and spoke in a voice that tried to stay casual, but cracked under its own uncertainty. "Who the hell is that?" She didn't get an answer, because just then the man stopped at the center of the aisle, and his eyes found her with quiet precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The woman you humiliated is my wife." The words didn't echo. They landed. Clean, unshaken, undeniable. Every person in the room froze. The prosecutor lowered her pen. The judge straightened without meaning to. Even the whispering in the back row evaporated like it had never existed. Grayson said nothing, because for the first time that day she had nothing left to say. Her confidence faltered. Her breath hitched. And in the span of a few seconds, the woman who had ruled the room with her smirks and her thinly veiled threats was now small, uncertain, and visibly searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing left. Because Elias Fields was not just a man. He was a mirror. And he had arrived not to make noise, but to reflect everything this courtroom had been willing to ignore. He didn't look around for effect. He didn't repeat himself. He simply stood there, rooted in silence, and let the weight of the truth do what years of words never could. And Monica, who had said nothing through it all, who had been stripped and tested and framed, without ever raising her voice, finally lifted her eyes. She met Grayson's gaze without anger, without vengeance, and without fear. There was no victory in her face, only clarity, because she had never needed to prove anything, and now they all knew why. Grayson turned her eyes away first. The judge cleared his throat, but found no words. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of consequence, full of understanding, full of reckoning. And in that moment, no one in the room doubted who held the most power. Not because he entered loudly, but because when he did, the room finally heard itself for the first time. The silence did not end when Elias spoke. It expanded. It settled into every seat, every breath, every paper resting untouched on the desks of people who had spent the better part of that day pretending not to see what had been unfolding before them. But now there was nothing left to pretend. The truth had walked in and taken its place without permission, and the room was still trying to understand what that meant. Elias didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, let the weight of what had just been said hang in the air like a closing argument no one was expecting, but everyone knew had landed where it needed to. Then with a calm that didn't ask for authority, but revealed it, he opened his briefcase and took out a single file. He did not raise it. He did not wave it for the room to see. He simply handed it to the bailiff, who for the first time that day looked unsure of who he was supposed to be taking orders from. The bailiff hesitated for a breath, then took the file and delivered it directly to the bench. The judge looked down at it without touching it, then looked up at Elias as if waiting for him to explain. Elias did not offer explanation. He offered proof. That file contained a full internal report from the Department of Justice, including transcripts, surveillance footage, a summary of prior complaints buried beneath bureaucratic language, and most importantly, audio recorded in that very courtroom from the moment Monica had sat down. The same courtroom that had accused her of being unfit. The same courtroom that had allowed her to be shoved, insulted, humiliated without interruption. The judge opened the file. His face, so practiced in neutrality, could no longer hold its shape. Line by line, image by image, the truth unraveled before him, not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, steady unmasking. There were voices, there were names, there were timelines that didn't match the stories told earlier that day. There was Grayson's voice, clear, undeniable. There were her words wrapped in protocol, but soaked in bias. And there was silence too, the silence of those who had chosen not to intervene. And now that silence was written down. Elias turned toward the center of the courtroom and nodded once toward an officer who had been standing near the back previously unnoticed. The officer stepped forward this time with no uncertainty and walked directly to Grayson, who rose from her chair in disbelief. She started to speak something between denial and confusion, but her words fell apart in her mouth before they could find structure. The officer didn't raise his voice. He simply informed her that she was being taken into custody pending formal charges and internal investigation. And before she could ask what charges, the officer read them calmly, one after another, like bricks, stacking in real time. The room did not erupt. It exhaled, quietly, collectively. And in that breath, justice stopped being a symbol and started becoming an action. The judge stood slowly, his eyes on Elias, then on Monica, then back down to the file. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The weight in his shoulders was louder than apology, heavier than guilt. It was the realization that he too had been seen. Elias did not look at the judge for long. He walked toward the bench, but stopped halfway. He turned this time, facing the entire courtroom, and when he spoke, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. Only now it carried something more than power. It carried reckoning. You judged her without listening. Now the country will listen to her silence. And with that, he stepped back, not as a man seeking attention, but as someone who had said what needed to be said and knew that the echoes would now speak for themselves. No one in the room moved to stop him. No one asked a question, because sometimes the most irreversible things arrive not in chaos, but in clarity. And clarity had just arrived. No one moved when Grayson was led out of the courtroom. They had all seen this moment justice began to turn, but they didn't yet know how to breathe in a room that had changed so completely. It wasn't that they were stunned. It was that the silence Monica had carried all morning had become something too sacred to interrupt. Monica stayed seated for a while longer, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that real strength does not rush to take the floor after the noise has faded. Her eyes weren't searching. Her hands didn't fidget. She was waiting, not for approval, not for applause. She was waiting for truth to settle in the room long enough that people could finally recognize its shape. When she rose, no one stood with her, but every gaze followed. She walked to the center of the room, the same space where her son had been judged without being heard, where her motherhood had been questioned without a word from her mouth. She looked at Mason first, and he looked back with a stillness no child should have learned so early, but somehow he carried it now. She gave him a single nod. Then she turned to the courtroom. Her voice did not rise. She did not need it to. I stayed silent so my son would know there's power in dignity. Nothing more. Nothing rehearsed. Just a sentence shaped by every moment she had swallowed, every insult she had absorbed, every second she had chosen not to respond. And because the silence before had been so loud, her words now filled the room without needing to echo. Somewhere near the back, a woman dropped her gaze and wiped her cheek with her sleeve. One of the jurors looked down, clasped his hands, and didn't lift his head again. The prosecutor, who had spoken earlier with cool certainty, now sat as if each word Monica had just said had peeled back something she didn't know was there. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only lowered her eyes, not in defeat, but in recognition. There was no gavel, no ruling, no statement from the bench, but justice had already spoken, and it had spoken through the one voice they had tried hardest to ignore. Outside the courthouse, it had begun. A video clip only 16 seconds long had already been posted, not by a news crew, but by someone in the crowd. It showed Monica rising, speaking, and sitting back down. No edits, no commentary, just that. And it was spreading faster than any press release ever could. People weren't just reposting it. They were listening to it. They were teaching it. They were asking why it took a woman's silence to expose what years of hearings had buried. That evening, major networks aired segments not about confrontation, but about composure. They showed images of Monica in the hallway sitting beside her son. They played audio from inside the courtroom, the muttered insult, the sighs, the judgment, the stillness. It was no longer about the hearing. It was about the hearing that came after the one happening across the country, in classrooms, in homes and offices, in conversations between parents and children who had always known but had never seen it laid bare with such quiet certainty. Grayson's name was everywhere, but not because she had been arrested, because people were finally counting the number of times someone like her had been believed over someone like Monica. Her past cases were reopened, her citations dissected. Her silence in other rooms with no cameras was no longer excusable. As for Judge Benning, he wasn't removed, not yet. But his rulings, his tone, his absence of presence were all under review. Public petitions called not just for his resignation, but for accountability from the entire system that had allowed this to play out in broad daylight and still hoped no one would notice. But they had noticed, because one woman had said one sentence, and they couldn't stop hearing it. Monica didn't return to that courthouse. She didn't give interviews. She didn't step in front of cameras. She went home with her son the same way she had walked in that morning, without spectacle, without noise, and with the kind of stillness that now carried the weight of thousands who had once felt unseen. That night at the kitchen table, she made him tea and sat in the chair across from him. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing left to explain. And when Mason finally broke the quiet, it wasn't a question. It was a truth. "I heard you, Mom." She looked at him for a long moment. Not surprised, not relieved, just full. "I know," and that was all. Because some stories don't end with a verdict. They end with a child understanding what dignity looks like when it stands still and lets the world catch up. There was no declaration from the judge, no sudden shift in volume, no official end to the hearing. Yet every person in that courtroom knew something had reached its conclusion. What had finished was not a trial, but a way of looking at someone like Monica and expecting her to fold. What ended was the assumption that dignity would always wait quietly in the back row. Monica stood without a hurry. Her movements were as calm and measured as they had been all day. She did not look for anyone's reaction. She didn't offer any final glance. She simply rose with her son and her husband and began walking the narrow path between rows of people who had only hours earlier barely noticed her. Now they stepped aside. They did not move in panic or embarrassment. They made space with quiet instinct, the way people do when they witness something that feels more significant than the setting it occurred in. There was no noise, only the shuffle of feet and the deepening hush that wrapped around her like respect too long delayed. As she passed through the crowd outside, no one reached for a microphone. No camera blocked her path. For a moment, the city held its breath. Monica moved forward, her posture unbroken, her presence more commanding in silence than most ever managed in speech. Near the back of the crowd, a woman turned to the man beside her. She did not raise her voice. She only whispered as if repeating something that might disappear if said too loudly. She didn't just survive this. She rewrote what justice looks like. Monica heard none of it. She did not need to. Her silence had already done its work. It had cracked something open that could not be sealed again. She stepped into the car without a word. Mason followed her, holding his own silence like something earned. Elias closed the door gently, then walked to the other side. By the time the car pulled away, the video had already begun to circulate. It was not sensational. No one was shouting. No one was being pulled apart. It was only Monica standing, offering one sentence, then walking away with the same steady rhythm that had carried her through the entire day. "I stayed silent so my son would know there is power in dignity." The internet reacted with something rare. It did not shout back. It listened. Clips of that moment were shared across platforms, not as protest, but as reminder. Teachers replayed it in classrooms. Commentators paused over it in podcasts. Parents showed it to their children, not as an example of strategy, but of strength. What had happened in that courtroom was no longer just about misconduct or the exposure of a flawed system. It had become something more difficult to measure and more lasting to carry. It had become a mirror, and people were seeing themselves inside it. Officer Grayson's name began appearing in internal review reports. Her history was no longer quiet. Judge Benning's decisions were revisited in the light of national scrutiny. He remained in his seat, but the shadow that followed him now stretched longer with every ruling. Monica, however, remained absent from the headlines. She gave no interviews. She signed no deals. She did not become a celebrity. She returned to her home, to her son, to the small routines that had always given her strength long before the world knew her name. That evening, she made tea without ceremony. She folded a blanket at the edge of the couch. And when Mason sat beside her, there was no dramatic conversation, no long debriefing of what had passed. He simply looked at her with eyes now clearer shaped, not by what she had said, but by what she had endured. "I heard you, Mom." She turned toward him. Her face held nothing theatrical, only the steady truth of someone who had carried a fire without letting it burn her voice. "I know." Nothing more needed to be said. Because the loudest stories are not always the ones filled with sound. Sometimes they are the ones that choose stillness over spectacle. Sometimes they are the ones that ask nothing but leave something lasting in return. As Monica closed her eyes that night, the world kept spinning, still noisy, still uncertain. But somewhere in that movement, there was now a pause that had not existed before, and it was shaped like her silence. Thank you for staying with us through this story. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a loud voice or a raised fist. Sometimes it walks into the room, quietly sits down, and simply refuses to disappear. Monica didn't win by shouting. She won by standing still, by holding her dignity when the world expected her to fall apart. And in doing so, she reminded us that silence, when it carries truth, can echo louder than any verdict. If this story moved you, if it made you think or reminded you of someone, we ask you to take one small step like this, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, where voices like Monica's are honored, remembered, and passed on. Your support doesn't just help this channel grow. It gives our creative team the strength to keep telling stories that matter, stories that speak softly but stay with you long after they're told. This is more than just a story. This is a reminder that quiet courage still changes the world.